Hope you had a good lunch, Bubba. What did you have?
Oh, just had a sandwich and some carrots.
There we go. Good stuff. Okay, we are live on Facebook, live on Zoom, top of the hour. Good morning, everybody from the Pacific time zone. It's 11 a.m. and another round of Bible studies or discussions with me and some of my friends from around the country. Today we have Bubba Garner with us. He's in the greater Houston area, Pasadena, Texas, and with the Southside Church. Bubba and I have an interesting history, and we go back 20 plus years at least, working many years together at the Dry Creek camp. One of my jobs there the last 11 or 12 years was being in cabin 3, the juniors, and making sure they were prepped and ready to go to cabin 1 the next year. I had to soften them up and get ready for the slave driver that Bubba is. Is that the way you saw it, Bubba?
Yes, although the way I remember it, your very first year, nobody would talk to you. So I was the first one to go and sit by you and welcome you, and you were a hit ever since.
Yeah, exactly. So that was, I'll never forget that, Bubba. That's so nice. Taking me by the hand, as I'm doing here, because this is your very first Zoom meeting, I understand.
That is correct.
Welcome to the 21st century. Get rid of the 8-track deck tapes and all that good stuff. So good to have you. Today we're going to look at the life of Joseph, sort of an overview of Genesis 37 through 50. So if you want to get your Bibles out, I'll read a few verses there. We're going to start in Genesis 37. And I always ask this question: of all the topics you could have chosen, Bubba, I gave you a few topics and the other guys, and right away you chose life of Joseph. What is it about the life of Joseph that stood out to you that wanted you to discuss this?
Well, I don't have a scientific poll to back up what I'm about to say, but it's been my experience that when you ask people about their favorite men and women in the Bible, one of the most often names that's at the top of the list is Joseph. And I think part of that is just there's so much space devoted to telling his story in the book of Genesis. And so we know a lot about him. But there are also things about Joseph that we can relate to. We've had family problems, or we've had people make accusations against us that were not true. And the goal is to try to handle it the way Joseph did. And so he has been, to me, an intriguing character through the years. And I've found in my teaching and preaching that when you do a lesson on Joseph, people can relate to him.
I agree. You can't just do one lesson. You need about 2 or 3 gospel meetings worth of lessons from Joseph. Certainly is one of those Christ-like characters that you look at those Old Testament characters, and a lot of them point us right to Christ. They're a type of Christ, Joshua, Moses, David, and I would add Joseph is right there up there with them. And of course, one of the big lessons is that of providence, and we'll get to some of that stuff later on, but there's a lot of good stuff in addition to what you said. Well, if you're quick, let's just go ahead. You had something? I saw your... Nope. Okay. Let's get into some of the text. Can you hear me okay, Bubba?
Yeah, there was a little lag there.
Unfortunately, I guess there will be. Yeah.
That's okay. I guess the only thing I would add to that is it's so interesting that we have all the space in the book of Genesis, but Joseph is not mentioned a whole lot in the New Testament. In fact, that great chapter of faith in Hebrews 11, he just gets one verse. Mm-hmm. So the majority of what we learn about him is from the historical record, even though there are so many ways that he points to Jesus, and as you said, is a type of Christ.
And that may be, as we talk about providence later on, I will get to that. That might be an underscore of how providence works. God is always there, but you don't always see him directly. And so there's maybe some good lessons there. Real quick, let's look at the life of Joseph, and then I'm going to run through some of this. Fill in the gaps for me, Bubba, and then we'll ask some lessons learned. And then I know you have some stuff about the bones and so forth, which is good. We talked about some of that. But in Genesis 37, I'm just going to run through this really quickly. You've got Joseph and his brothers, and what I see here, and I've got this from my friend David Posey and other places, is, what he does is he serves faithfully and he prospers, and then he becomes a favorite of his father, and then he receives this coat of distinction. His father gave this to him, and then he's betrayed for his faithfulness, but then that coat is now stripped off of him, and then he's cast into a pit, and that Hebrew word is bor, B-O-R, and that code is used to deceive. Now, those points maybe I'll type up later for the notes. That's exactly the same thing that happens in Genesis 39 when he's in Potiphar's house. The code is used to deceive. He served faithfully and he prospers, and he becomes a favorite, Potiphar's number one man. He's betrayed for his faithfulness. Potiphar's wife goes after him. He's cast into a pit, and the Hebrew word there is bor again, sort of a dungeon, and the code is used to deceive. So there's some sort of an elegance there of the story that is setting us up. And let me just go back to chapter 37. You have some things here where he's the favorite, but he did the father really help him by singling him out of all the brothers and say, here, you're my favorite one? How's that for good parenting skills, Bubba?
Right. And it underscores the dangers and difficulties when you depart from God's pattern and plan for the family. God never intended for one man to have that many wives. And when you have so many children by so many wives, there's going to be conflict and jealousy, even among not just the children, but the ladies themselves, as we know wives of Jacob did. And what fascinates me is it said that they hated him. His brothers hated him. They weren't just jealous. They weren't just angry. They hated him so much that they would have killed him had the oldest Reuben not intervened on his behalf.
It's interesting. Reuben intervenes, and we'll see him later on when kind of the dust settles from the story, and after the famine, they come back and Joseph dies, and Reuben's saying, basically, I knew this guy's going to get us. I told you guys, even later on. So that Reuben narrative continues a few times. There's an interesting, I don't know how much time we want to spend on this, but Joseph is Genesis 37 through 50. But if you read chapter 38, it's like, where in the world does that fit into the Joseph story? Have you ever thought about that?
No, the only thing I can come up with is that it was just an attempt to keep everything chronological. That's the way it happened in real time, and so rather than placing that somewhere else so as not to interrupt the Joseph narrative, it just kept it chronological. That's right, what Judah, I can explain.
Yeah, Judah Tamar it's just sort of a side note to the Joseph story, but now back to the Joseph story, and that's right. Really, chapter 38 is a different story altogether. But back in chapter 39, the second really wave of Joseph and his coat, he 39 and verse 1, it says, taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar takes him on as a servant, but then Potiphar takes off on a trip. And it says in verse 6, Joseph was handsome in appearance. Verse 7, his master's wife looked at Joseph with desire and said, to lie with me. And in verse 8, he refused. What always gets me about this story, Bubba, is the reason why he refused. He didn't say, look, I might lose my job here. I can't do this. What was the reason he refused? Verse 9, as well as anybody.
Right. That is a great evil and a sin against God. That was why he refused her. You look at the other parts of the chapter, and it tells about how the Lord was with Joseph. That's why he was made to prosper in the house and then later in the prison, because the Lord was with him. And so Joseph's motivation was, God has been with me. He's caused me to prosper in these difficult circumstances. How could I do this to him? How could I sin against a God who has been with me and blessed me? And, for us married men, when we have to flee fornication, we might think, oh, that would hurt my wife. I just couldn't do that to her, or my kids would be so disappointed in me. And certainly that is the case. But our first thought should be, how could I do this to God? He's been so good to me. How could I do this great evil against him? That's where Joseph was.
I like the motivation. And to me, you're right. It's more than just saying, no, thank you. Thanks anyway. I'm honored you would think of me this way. It's, I got to get out of here. It's that flee immorality, but I do like the reasons as to why. And again, I think this is another thing that keeps coming up with Joseph. I'm going to point that out in other areas where his motivation is not just, this is wrong, I can't do this, my conscience would bother me, other people might be looking. It is, I mean, he had a chance to pull this off if he wanted to with Potiphar's wife. He probably could have gotten away with it, but he chose not to for the right reasons, and he clarifies the right reasons. And of course, that turns on him, because then in verse 12, chapter 39, caught him his garment, and when she had left, she turns it on him and says, it's your fault, and look what he did to me. And then he's thrown into the dungeon, thrown into prison, and there's that pit or that bore again. But now in chapter 40, he finds himself in jail, and the king has go ahead.
Well, and how about the fact that this was not just a one-time proposition, but she was after him day after day. She could have worn him down, and he could have had the attitude eventually of, well, I'm here and I might as well enjoy myself or get something out of this terrible experience. My family hates me. They've sent me out here. Dad hasn't tried to come find me. I might as well get some enjoyment out of this slavery. But day after day, he refused her until finally it cost him his position and his trust with Potiphar.
He didn't know if his dad was alive. He knew his brothers hated him and left him for dead and sold him off to a foreign land. You're right. He could have easily rationalized, might as well have some fun in the process. And yes, he chose not to. And that's I think one of the deeper lessons of Facebook, of Joseph. My mind is on Facebook just for a moment. I made the comment and we talked briefly about Genesis 38. We don't have time to go back there. I want to talk about Joseph here, but we have people like Gerald Saltz, who's here, and I know he's written a really good article on Genesis 38. Jared, if you're listening, maybe you can post that here in the Facebook comments. We can look at it later. Or Jared, maybe you and I can do a study on that. That'd be a fascinating one. Chris Emerson says he's about to faint. He sees Bubba on Facebook. There's some others here who are seeing you here. And it's like the second coming is coming here. We don't know what's going to happen next with Bubba on Facebook. Well, look what I can do, guys. The magic of the influence I have. So
that's great.
So let's go back to Joseph. So yes, in chapter 40, he finds himself in jail because of this. He refuses the sensuality, and look where this gets him. And many people would have said, look at how God is blessing me. I end up in prison ends up being a couple years. He ends up being this guy that can interpret dreams, and he gets to be known that way. But the plea in chapter 40 and verse 14, there's this dream. But again, look at what Joseph says. Joseph says, only keep me in mind when it goes well with you, and please do me kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. And I was like, yeah, okay, whatever, dude, we'll do that for you. But then later on, when the dreams are settled in verse 23, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph and forgot him. Here's another betrayal because of his faithfulness, really. He's stepping up and trying to do the right thing. And so he's in jail for another 2 years, it says, because of this. How many people would be faithful still up to this point?
Well, and that's a connection we can make, kind of a similarity between Joseph and Daniel. Both of them kept being promoted. Both of them prospered because of their trust in the Lord. Both of them had the ability to interpret the dreams of the king. So even in our captivity, and we can think of this stay home, stay safe ordinance as being captive and exiles in a way. But even then, we can find ways to serve God and promote the gospel, just as we're doing here today with this cockamamie affair.
Right, exactly. That's a one way to describe it, exactly. So you get to chapter 41, and you have this other dream, 2 full years in chapter 41 and verse 1, 2 full years. Pharaoh has a dream, and I always like to give this to new converts just for fun. You got a dream of 7 fat cows and then 7 skinny cows. Stop right there. What in the world does that mean? And that's Pharaoh in a nutshell, looking for answers here. And you really only find answers by going either to God or his people, his word. And here Joseph gives the answer. What's the interpretation of that dream, Bubba?
Well, it makes me kind of envious that something skinny could eat something fat and not get any fatter. Wouldn't that be nice? We could all do that.
Yeah.
But it's again God ruling in the kingdoms of the world. It's showing that he's in control and he created the world. He's going to sustain the world. He's always on the throne. And now he's giving opportunity for the people of Egypt to prepare for this great famine that's going to come after 7 years of abundance.
It's his dream that troubles Pharaoh. He wants the answers. He searches around. Joseph is the man to give that answer. And again, here's a chance for Joseph to say, yeah, look at me. I scored that 3-pointer. I tackled that quarterback. Look at me. It's all about me. He could have done that kind of moment, but yet look what he says in 41 and verse 16. Joseph answered Pharaoh saying, it is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. To me, that goes right back to chapter 39 and verse 9, Potiphar and his wife who he served. I can't do this because of who God is and who I am. And here's a second time that motivation in chapter 41, verse 16. It's not me giving the answer here. It's God who is behind this. Let's give God the glory. How tempting is it to be in this position and say, I could take the accolades and the pride and I'm going to sit on the crown and you can kiss my ring. How tempting is that? But here's a man full of humility, right?
Especially, remember, he's still considered a prisoner, and this could be his ticket out. And I can finally not only get out of prison, maybe I can go back home, find my family. And so that would have been a great temptation for him to take that upon himself. But even then, no, the glory goes to God. The only way I can interpret this dream is if God gives me the ability to do that. So, as you said, great humility, especially in these, which could have been very selfish circumstances.
Right. As there's touching now on some of the depths of the rich lessons of Joseph's life. The rest of chapter 41 is that you get this graphic description of this dream and then save up for the famine. You got 7 years to save up because there's another 7 years of famine. And that certainly plays into, well, the people in Israel get hungry. That's going to be the reuniting of the family, as we'll get there eventually. But Joseph is made ruler now over Egypt. And that's where that cycle ends. He is, he's faithful. He's given a coat of distinction again for a third time. He's given these kind of kingly garments, but then he's not betrayed this time. He's now blessed, and he's made basically prime minister over Egypt, the major kingdoms of the time. So he is getting blessed in his own way.
So there's no boar.
40, go ahead.
No boar with this coat?
I don't see one, no.
Okay. Because that was my third point for Sunday night. I needed that. All right.
Did you? Okay, very good. Yeah, I get a bunch of sermon outlines myself here, and we got a few guys listening in, so perfect. Thank you. Exactly. Chapter, when you borrow from me, you borrow from the best, Bubba.
That's true. Yeah.
Chapter 42.
JC.
There we go. JC. Brothers got to eat in chapter 42 is how I call this. Brothers get hungry. And chapter 42, verses 8, Joseph recognizes brothers, although they didn't recognize him. How is that even possible?
Well, I would say because they were not looking for him there. They were not anticipating, to their knowledge, he may not even still be alive. So his appearance had obviously changed quite a bit since they had seen him as a 17-year-old boy. But they probably looked about the same. So it's that same deal where sometimes we see someone who's not in their element or out of place as what we're used to, and we just don't recognize them. I remember, of course, when I'm not in isolation, I wear a shirt tie to the office every day. And one day it was a Saturday, and so I just had shorts and a t-shirt on, and I had to go to the print shop to pick up some stuff that we printed for class. And I walked in, and the guy who waits on me every day said, "Oh, you look like a human today." Well, I think the same thing with Joseph. He didn't look like what they were expecting or what they remembered, so they just didn't recognize him.
I'm surprised you're not wearing a suit and tie right now, Bubba. I think other people are shocked by that.
Yeah, well, I have it on underneath this. This is what I
Okay,
do
very
for the
good.
common people. For you
I
guys
thought
on the West Coast, I try to be all things to all men.
that's exactly right. Well, I have the S underneath this, the Superman. So, you've got, and if you do a study, Joseph is about 17 or 18 years old when he gets taken off, and then this is at least 7 or 8 years later, at least. And it's kind of an interesting study. It's for fun. You can go back and look at your picture of yourself when you're 17, and then take another picture when you're 25, and there's a little difference there. Plus, they weren't expecting to see their brother there as well. As you said, going to the print shop and dressed differently. And so there's no expectations here. Some, I think, question that. That's an interesting question, but you just do a research or a little study of appearances, and 7 or 10 years later, and if you're not expecting it out of sorts, you're not going to expect that at all. That is sort of interesting. But then you get Reuben in chapter 42 and verse 22. Reuben answered, "Did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy? And you would not listen. Now comes the reckoning for his blood." And so somehow he remembered how that went back in chapter 37. And he was the one who said, "Let's not kill our brother." Okay, sold him to the Midianites and then carted them off to Egypt. But it's interesting. That's an interesting tie-in to the story here. The older brother Reuben, maybe could have been a better older brother, but let's save the life here, but let's not do too much. I can't stop these guys.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
And doesn't it show you just how long you hold on to sin when you don't repent? I mean, as you said, it has been a number of years since they did that. But their first thought when this adversity comes is, this is payback. God's finally judging us for what we did to our brother. So when you don't repent of sin, you hold on to it, and it constantly weighs on your mind, and it's like a burden on your shoulders. This was something that they just couldn't let go of. And I would say something about them, just again, how much they hated their brother when they told Jacob and deceived him with the coat and saw the sorrow of their father, how it destroyed him. They hated Joseph so much that it didn't even bother them to let their dad cry like that. Hold on, Dad, we're lying. He's really not dead. They let that happen, and so here years later they think, well, it's finally come back to haunt us.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's going to be underscored again in chapter 50. We'll get there, Lord willing, eventually, when Daddy dies. And the brothers at that point even say, okay, is he now going to kill us? Is he now going to mistreat us? And that's when Joseph famously says, "You meant it for evil, God meant it for good." And we'll get there later on. But to me, that underscores that point. And maybe it was that that's a great tie-in. The day after Genesis 37, hey, your brother's gone. Your youngest son, who you love so much, he's just gone. Sorry. And here he's in mourning, and they just let him think that for the longest time. That's horrible. That's a horrible, cruel way to treat loved ones. And it kind of tells about their heart at that point.
Well, just a dysfunctional family. Even in the Bible, you have those.
Right. Well, look at Jacob and Laban and all that trickery and everything else. I mean, where did that come from? It goes way back. And it was Jacob's mother after all, too. So you just go back and back and back there. So
that's right.
Chapter 43, you've got this concern that Joseph has about his father. And when he finds out Daddy is alive, where does it? Chapter 43 and verse 33, I think it is. When they were seated before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, the youngest according to his youth, the men looked at each other with astonishment. I think that's the wrong verse I'm looking for.
Well, it does show, though, just as you said, favoritism has now carried on. Joseph received it from his father, and now he's doing the same thing with Benjamin, who was his full brother with his mother and father. So now Joseph is doing the very same thing that caused him to be despised among his brothers. So we learn from our parents, and we pass that on to our children, and somewhere along the line that cycle has to be broken, or it's just going to continue on for generations to come.
It's true. Verse 30 is what I was thinking of. Chapter 43 and verse 30. The concern Joseph has at this point is my daddy alive? Verse 27. Is he still alive? Verse 30. He hears that he is. And then Joseph hurries out, deeply stirred over his brother, and sought a place to weep, entered his chamber and wept there. And I translate that he's overjoyed. He's been thinking of his daddy for so long, and it's been so many years, and he's just beside himself that he's alive still. And then that seems to be his goal now, to use his brothers to bring him back here. And if they're having famine there, we've got abundance over here. I can make this work. And this is some of the reasons why he can say, you meant this for evil, God meant it for good. God placed me here. So
yeah, you start seeing the wheels turn here as to what's happening and why God sent Joseph ahead. It's not only an inspired it's not only inspired writing in the scriptures, but it's a very well told story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of elegance here. It's a lot of fun to massage up and just really speak the text and step out of the way with our personalities here and let it really speak for itself, or just try to accentuate the story here. Chapter 45. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. And Joseph just can't take it anymore. And he says, I got to reveal myself to you. In chapter 45 and in verse 5, he said, don't be grieved, don't be angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. God sent me before you to preserve life. And so his concern is, think about what Joseph could have done to his brothers. Okay, guys, line up against the wall. Remember what you did to me back in chapter 37? I remember what you did to me, and here's I'm going to do unto you as you've done unto me. He could have taken that route all the way, but look where Joseph goes with this. Go ahead.
Yeah, he didn't get even. When he had the opportunity, he could have thrown each one of them in a pit and say, well, how do you like that? And we'll have opportunities like that in our life where we'll want to get back or get even with those who have done us evil or harm. And so here's just another way in which Joseph is a wonderful example of being gracious with the grace that's been given to us.
Another point from chapter 45 I want to touch on is that here's Joseph, sort of just obviously by the providence of God, living in Egypt and establishing himself very well. And then he gets, again, promoted to be prime minister of Egypt, basically. And then Pharaoh does another favor for him, doesn't he? Pharaoh, in verse 11, 45 and verse 11, I will provide for you. There are still 5 years of famine to come. Verse 13, tell my father of all my splendor of Egypt. Pharaoh allows that to happen. So there's this great relationship between Egypt, Pharaoh, and Joseph. Let's speak for a moment how something like that happens, because he was not a native Egyptian. A guy named Philip Martin here is saying that Joseph seemed to be walking like an Egyptian. So, Bubba, everybody's ready for you to sing that song for us and do your head shake back and forth about what it means to walk like an Egyptian. But really, Joseph established himself, and no matter where he found himself, he was going to do God's will. And look how that's rewarded here.
And it's hard to imagine, isn't it, that these Egyptians will be the same ones who will years later enslaved these people. Here Joseph, through the providence of God, saves them during this worldwide famine. And the payback is, well, you're going to be our slaves for under 30 years. So it's just hard to see that turn coming.
I'm going to make a point of that later on, but that's exactly right. You see this great relationship of Joseph and Pharaoh, and look what it leads to: saving of the people, saving of Joseph's family as they move to Egypt to get the food just for basic survival. But then in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8, there's a new Pharaoh that arises that really changes things, doesn't it? That's for now, Joseph was good to them, but now there's a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, and that changes things. And then Moses then rises to the scene, but that's just carrying out the story. So chapter 47, 46, 47, they move to Egypt. Let's go to chapter 48 and 49. You've got Israel's last days. You got Israel's blessings here. Before we get to chapter 50, verses 15 through 20, you have anything you want to talk about as far as, you're talking about the bones being carried into the land and all that?
I was going to save that for the big finale.
Okay, very good. Well, the finale's not there yet. Let's go to chapter 50 then. Here we go. Chapter 50, because there's a blessings on all the tribes in chapter 40. But let's just focus a little bit in chapter 50. Let me read verses 15 through 21. There's a great statement here. Genesis 50, verses 15 through 21. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him?" So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father charged before he died, saying, 'You shall say to Joseph, please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brothers and their sin, for they did you wrong. And now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father.' Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers came down and fell before him and said, 'Behold, we are your servants.' And Joseph said to them, 'Do not be afraid. I am in God's place. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones.' He comforted them and spoke kindly to them." There's a lot there, Bubba. Go ahead.
What chapter are you in?
Yeah,
No, I'm kidding. No, I'm kidding.
Genesis chapter 52.
Well, we kind of have a preview of that when Joseph first reveals himself to his brothers. And of course, they're very distraught about the turn of events. And he tells them there in chapter 45, "It was not you who sent me here, but God." So Joseph was already able to put the pieces together to realize the reason he had been sent to Egypt was so he would be in the position to interpret Pharaoh's dream, preserve food for his people, and then when they came to Egypt for food, they had the storehouses ready to preserve life for them. So we see that same thing here, that God was able to take something evil and turn it to good. And we have that same assurance that he will do that for us. Even in these circumstances we're in, we're already seeing how God is using these for good. People are now, I think, more appreciative of the blessing of the public worship service, and we're missing that. People are finding new ways to be evangelistic, and so these are terrible circumstances we're in for our country, but we trust that God can make those into something good
For our country and for the world, really. It's not just us. It's a worldwide situation here. Some
Right,
concern I've heard about the lack of meeting is, will people get used to this? Can you hear me, Bubba? Are you still there?
Yes.
Okay, good. Some people have asked me about that concern about, will people get used to this online video worship, whatever we're doing, whatever churches are doing? And my answer was, after Hurricane Katrina hit us pretty hard in New Orleans, we didn't meet for 4 or 5 weeks at least. And and there was that concern that we didn't have Zoom meetings then, but right after the dust settled and the waters receded and the buildings were built back, and our attendance was just dynamite for a good year or two because people missed that. And also those who were sort of lackadaisical about their attendance realized I missed that even more. And how dare that was taken away from me. So I hope that's the same effect here. Right now, our state's in a shelter in until the end of the month, until May 4th, as of last night. So that's another 4 or 5 Sundays. Hit the Northwest pretty hard. We've got a few deaths in our county. And so it hit us pretty hard here, this virus. And,
kind of where it started, isn't it, Jeff?
I think
in Washington State.
Seattle led the nation early on. They were the original hotspot. That's 3 hours to our north, but we had 6 or 7 deaths in our county. And I see you've got the virus yourself, the way you're.
I do. I'm just coming down with it.
Well, I hope it doesn't transmit through Facebook and Zoom. I hope it's not that contagious. So
let me ask you this, because that's something I've wondered too. When we do come back together and there is the excitement and joy. So you did see that as something that leveled out over time?
Oh, absolutely. It didn't take long to get back to normal, unfortunately. But you try to strike the iron when it's hot. To me, it's like 9/11. People were a lot more serious about God right after that. But I remember after 9/11, about a year or two later, I'm watching on a news program, a high-speed chase in Houston, Texas, of all places. And I thought, we're back to normal. This is it. And after Katrina, things were well for a year or two, but then crime started to spike in New Orleans and so forth when I was living there. And I realized people have forgotten. And so right now for us, the lesson is this is hitting everybody. When those doors open and we can meet like before and greet each other with a holy kiss, not just on the internet, it's going to be a great time. And one reason I do this, just a little secret, I wanted to do these online Bible studies, is I'm always out there trying to get contacts. And there's a few that I was working on with my circle of influence with Toastmasters, Little League Baseball with my kids, or leader of a homeschool co-op. And some of those people are listening right now. And I don't want to be taken away from them. So they have a way to get spiritually fed. But I tell you what, Bubba, I'm longing for the days when I can cancel this Zoom account and go back to day by day meeting together and all that. And I think a lot of people are that way. This is an interruption, but what's taken away from you helped us all appreciate what a blessing it is to meet together and go together to the house of the Lord and worship together and assemble together.
Absolutely. We're thankful for technology and we're doing the best we can with it, but it just doesn't replace the face-to-face, hand-to-hand, brother-to-brother assembly that God has given the local church.
Not funny. We give lessons a lot about the benefits of a local church. Well, this is exhibit A of why that is, and this is forcing that. And this might be a good illustration to remember. Remember when it was taken away from you. And this may be a 5, 10-year, 20-year lesson when we want to make an illustration about, is there any benefit at all to local attendance? Well, if you remember the coronavirus days, this is a good remember of that, stuck in your house and so forth. I want to talk about the providence of God, because that's certainly one thing that comes out here in chapter 50 and verse 20. In fact, in verse 21, he says, I will provide for you, the key word of providence. The providence of God is a fascinating study. If you're asked, Bubba, do you believe that God works today? I hope that providence and prayer are some of your number one answers here. And we don't always see that until later on. We look back on like I just did on 9/11 or Katrina. There was some providence there that led to some conversions I can attest to, and a few others. Had that not happened, I'm not sure that would have happened. But here the providence of God means God is providing for us. But what is really God providing for? How does he provide for us? Is he going to make you rich and wealthy? Didn't happen to Joseph, did it?
Right. Well, as you well know, as a fellow avid reader of the United States presidents, early on, the presidents in their writing didn't always mention God by name. A lot of times they just used the word providence with a capital P. That was the way they referred to God. In fact, after the Battle of New Orleans, then General Andrew Jackson wrote that the hand of providence was with us in his army and bringing about the victory. So providence has long been attached to God, and as evidence of his working in the world. As you said, it's not always easy to recognize it when you're right in the middle. Usually it takes looking back and seeing how he brought things together to know for certain that, yes, God is involved and he is working his plan in his time.
I look at providence this way as well. What God provides for, because that's providence, means provide for. What is he providing for us? He did not provide Joseph to be rich and healthy and have the best wife in the world and all these things. He provided opportunities for Joseph to serve. And I think, to me, that really gets to the heart of what biblical providence is. Again, let me say that again. He provides opportunities for us to serve God. And that's what Joseph did, right? He had an opportunity to serve God in Potiphar's house, in the jail, as prime minister of Egypt. No matter where he found himself, God provided him a way to serve. And now here's a chance to interpret a dream of 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows. And here's an opportunity for him to provide a way of his family to be fed and escape a famine. Another example story in our Bibles of providence is Esther. And the word of God is the name God is never mentioned at all in that book. But to me, that underscores how providence works, because we can see God working behind the scenes the whole time. Haman wants to kill everybody and kill the Jews. And God provides Esther a place where she can go into the king and say, save my people. And again, the providence there was an opportunity to serve. And I think that's how God's providence works for us today. His providence is there, but the providence is us have this opportunity to serve. What are we doing with that?
That's a great point, because both in Esther and Joseph, you don't see God working that through miracles. Really, the only miracles in Joseph's story are the ability to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh that Joseph has. Everything else is just the natural events of life. So God is able, through his power and providence, to bring about his will just through our serving him, as you said. The thing about Esther and the question that she is asked by her uncle Mordecai when she's contemplating going into the king. And of course, we know he says, you may have reached this position for such a time as this. But he also says before that, who knows that you haven't reached this position for such a time as this. So again, even when you're right in the middle of it, you don't know for sure. It takes the unfolding of events and looking back, and then we can perhaps determine God's providence.
Right. One comment on Facebook I want to read from Tamara Forsyth. There's a lot of good comments. Tamara Forsyth says, this is so needed, especially knowing Satan will absolutely use isolation from our spiritual family as a tactic if we allow it. If we use this time wisely, I believe we will see God's providence in so many ways. That's not just her belief. I think that's backed up in scripture, as we're talked about. These are just different opportunities for us, right? We need to not be idle. So I'm going to encourage you, Bubba, to go to your Facebook page and read all the comments. Oh, wait, you don't have Facebook. That's right. So you can find another way to read all those great comments that are coming in on Facebook.
Tamara, just send it to my home address and I'll read it.
Yeah, exactly. Just mail him. Yeah, exactly. Are they still quarantined or not? Who knows?
Oh, no, we trust him.
There we go.
She makes a great point, though. The devil is not idle right now. We can be certain, just like we're looking for opportunities during this time, he's also finding ways of temptation. And one of the ways I see that is how are we using our time? Are we just going to binge watch Netflix or simply clean out the closets, or are we going to use this time to do things that's always been our excuse? Well, I'll do this when I have time. A lot of us have time that we didn't anticipate. So let's absolutely use that. And then who knows how God will use that for the accomplishment of his purpose and plan.
Well, some of us might lounge around in our pajamas like you are today. I see. Again, you don't have that tie on, so maybe we'll fix that for you, Bubba. So
I do have slacks and dress shoes on, so
I'm sure you do. Okay.
halfway there.
We've got about 10, 15 minutes left in that time. Let's talk about some of the lessons from Joseph's life. Let's just kind of wrap it up that way. Lessons or application. What do you got?
One thing, you don't have to be a slave to your circumstances. So Joseph, from no fault of his own, was made a slave in Potiphar's house. And he could have very easily just resigned his fate to that. I'm going to be a slave, or I'm going to be enslaved. But he kept finding ways to prosper. Of course, the Lord was with him, as we read there in Genesis 39. But he decided that he could still be someone who was successful. And because he devoted himself to the Lord did cause him to be promoted, even in his circumstances. So instead of us being bitter about where we are and throwing up our hands in defeat, we need to realize that our circumstances don't define who we are. And if we'll stay committed to the Lord, then he'll put us in an opportunity where we can advance and be successful.
Good. I like that, being a slave, because that word slave can be played a couple ways. Slave as he was, or a slave to our circumstances. Underscores again what happens in Philippians 2 and verse 12. Do all things without grumbling. If you just are thankful for the way God's providence works. Again, providence is God providing opportunities for you to serve. I think if you look at it that way, you can be grateful for opportunities. Yeah, these times are no fun right now. I mean, when this thing happened to us, 2 weeks ago, I was a little scared. People made a run on food in the supermarkets. And so my solution was to get there before everybody else and get as much as I could. And you just react in different ways when I got 3 kids at home. I want to feed them, type of thing. But let's not get bitter. Let's get active. As Satan is active, we need to be active as well. I have a lot of things here, but he showed remarkable brotherly love. He was a devoted son. He learned to depend on God. He learned through his trials. He returned good for evil, all those things that I think we've spoken about. Do you have anything else as far as is this the time for the grand finale here, Bubba?
No, not just yet.
Not okay.
I have don't add trouble to trouble. We mentioned that briefly when we were talking about the temptation of Potiphar's wife, which I call her the original desperate housewife. But she gave him an opportunity to find evil, to do evil when he was in an evil circumstance. And a lot of people fall into that trap. For instance, the teenager feels like their parents don't trust them, or they're being unfair, and I have too many rules. Well, and then they sneak out, or they go drinking with their friends. Well, is that going to help your parents trust you more or less? Is that going to give you more responsibilities or less? So they've added trouble to trouble. Or maybe the husband has a bad day at the office and things don't go well. And so he comes home and takes it out on his family, either verbally or physically, whatever. Well, that's not going to help anything at the office the next day. And now you've got things bad at home. Or the wife who says, my husband won't communicate with me, doesn't talk to me. And so she finds one who does. And then they commit adultery. And has that helped the communication gap any? So don't add trouble to trouble. Committing fornication with Potiphar's wife was not going to bring Joseph's family back. It wasn't going to right all the wrongs that had happened to him. All it was going to do was add trouble to trouble. So we need to be careful about that.
Great application points there, Bubba. And I did hear the phrase original desperate housewife. I'm amazed you could say that with a straight face and keep going. I almost laughed out loud, but I kept it in. So
Well, I wasn't sure if you got that.
that
Used to be a television show. I never watched it, but so I've heard.
Well, you got time to Netflix it, as you were talking about. Since you got so much time on your hands now, I'm sure you and your family are going to catch up on every episode of every series. So, very good. One thing about
That's true. I still got to get going on The Mandalorian. I haven't watched that yet.
Yeah, whatever. All the Marvel movies and everything else. One point I want to make again about Joseph is in chapter 45 and verse 16. Chapter 45 and verse 16, when the news was heard in Pharaoh's house, Joseph's brothers had come. It pleased Pharaoh and his servants. That is just underscores the relationship that Joseph could have with a world leader like Pharaoh. Mm-hmm. Joseph appears to me a guy who could be approachable, a good servant, one who would listen, a good heart. All those things come into play. And what I want to point out is look at the results of that. Him and Pharaoh had this great relationship, and look what it led to. Look how God was blessing him. But when all this is done, if you look at the next book, Exodus 1 and verse 8, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. There's this new dynasty that takes over. And if you step back from the story here, Joseph and Pharaoh in Egypt had a great relationship for a number of years, but next dynasty happens in Exodus 1 and verse 8, and boy, it really changes gears here. And that just underscores that you really got to make the most of your opportunity in front of you, because you don't know when things might change. A month ago, we didn't know when things were going to, we didn't expect this. We didn't expect to be here a month ago in this circumstance. And so we always have to be good stewards of what God gives us, including our time and our opportunities. And maybe that's one way God is providing for us. What's in front of you? I'll get to that later. Later may never happen. That's why we need to make sure we're making the most of our time, because we don't know when a new king in Egypt may arise and circumstances will just turn upside down for us.
That's a great point. I didn't know you had that in you. It
is amazing. Enough time in cabin 3. That's why.
Oh, this is great. We're laughing and nobody knows what's going on.
Exactly.
Who would have thought a few weeks ago that we would be in this situation? I mean, we knew it was happening in other countries, but this doesn't happen in the U.S., certainly not us. And now here we are, just a few weeks behind where everybody else was. So great point. You gotta strike while the opportunity is there, because they never saw this coming, that this same people who embraced them and welcomed them and realized the salvation they had brought to the land of Egypt now completely turns the tables and makes them their servants.
Mm-hmm. One way I learned that lesson, Bubba, was my Katrina experience living in New Orleans. And one day we're living life and hear about a storm brewing off the coast of Florida. Then 3 days later, it's knocking our house down and we're homeless and jobless. What do we do? And that just told me that In His Time is a good song to sing in that time and make the most. I've never been the same since that. And I know that Houston had some flooding 2-3 years ago that was devastating there in Beaumont, and people there will never be the same either. It's just that kind of effect. And I'm not sure we'll be the same either after this. It's going to be, once you cough in public a year from now, people are going to back up from you and think, yikes. And you're going to be that leper without yelling unclean. Right. It'll be interesting to see how the dust settles with all of this. It doesn't minimize our obligation to serve God and to be Christians at all. It's just going to be different. And we need to pray for opportunities and pray for wisdom to navigate through those opportunities.
I was thinking that this week, that from now on, BC is probably going to be before Corona.
There we go.
This is the event that's going to change how we do a lot of things, and
Right.
it's frightening because we're still likely several weeks away from knowing what the long-term effects will be.
I'll be looking for your article on how do we greet each other with a holy kiss when all this is done, Bubba. That's your assignment for the next few
Okay.
weeks. Very good.
I'll work on that. That
I
sounds
think
like
grand finale
something.
time. Very good.
All right. So Hebrews 11, all those great heroes. Joseph is given one verse, and it's not anything related to what we've spent the last hour talking about in his life. It has nothing to do with the dreams he interpreted or his advancement in Egypt or his victory in temptation over Potiphar's wife and how he treated his brothers and the love that he and his father had for one another. Here's the verse that's given to Joseph in Hebrews 11 and verse 22. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. So by faith, Joseph was able to look far off into the future and realize Egypt is not our final home. God has promised a land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, my fathers. And so his last words were, when God brings us out of here, you dig up my bones and you take them with you and you bury them in that promised land. And so Genesis 15, verse 24 is where he says that. In Exodus 13, when the Israelites are preparing to leave in verse 19, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. So he had them. And then in Joshua 24, verse 32, when they finally crossed the river and conquered the land and start settling in their new home, Joshua 44:32, they buried the bones of Joseph, which the sons of Israel brought up from Egypt at Shechem in the piece of ground which Jacob had bought. So by faith, Joseph was able to see God's not through providing for us. He has a plan, and I want to be part of it when that time comes.
It's a very touching conclusion. It shows that people had respect for Joseph. They wanted to carry out that final wish. And you mentioned Exodus and Joshua and brought that home. And really, why was that? It really underscores what's said in Hebrews 11 about what faith is. Hebrews 11:1 and Hebrews 11 and verse 6 defines faith as believing in God, and then God will reward you for serving him. So Joseph believed that to the core, lived it, and even in death, he was respected and appreciated to the point where he said, bring his bones back. And that's very telling of Joseph, and that's why he's such a major character for us. Great conclusion, great application. Anything else, Bubba, before we sign off here?
No, Jeff, I just, I want to say, I know you and I love to joke around, and that's been a part of our relationship the last many years. But I want you to know how much I respect what you're doing and have respect for you as a preacher and a father and a husband. And I'm privileged to be your friend and co-laborer in the gospel. God bless you.
Thank you, Bubba. I do appreciate that. We do have a fondness for each other, and jokes aside, it's mutual, and I'm glad we can see it today on Facebook and Zoom, and good to see you. Maybe one day we'll get to embrace each other in this life, if not the next life, and either way will be great. And
I'd love that, brother.
Yeah. So thanks again for the time and sharing your thoughts with us. Why don't you go ahead and say goodbye to Facebook that you're never on, because they still see you here.
I'm
going to ask you to start over because you muted yourself. Start again.
Oh, well, see, there you go. It's not meant
Try to
to
say
be.
goodbye one more time, would you, in a dignified manner? You're live. How do you say
No,
goodbye?
thank you. Yeah, it's been an honor, and I hope I never see you again.
Very good. Let me stop the live stream. Hang on the line, Bubba. Let me stop Facebook.